The roar of a diesel engine ripped through the morning quiet, a jarring, alien sound against the birdsong and the gentle rustle of leaves in Maplewood Hills. I stood at my kitchen window, my coffee cold and forgotten in my hand, feeling the vibration of the earth through the soles of my feet. Out there, in the pale orange glow of dawn, a yellow monster sat poised at the edge of my lawn. A caterpillar bulldozer, its massive steel blade glinting menacingly, like some prehistoric predator about to charge. Behind it, a white pickup truck with Hart's Demolition painted crudely on the side. But it wasn't the machine of destruction that made my stomach twist into a cold knot. It was the woman standing beside it, dressed in a flawless, cream-colored pantsuit, as if she were heading to a corporate board meeting, not a property demolition. Alicia Thomas, our HOA president. Her blonde hair was pulled back in a perfect chignon, her makeup immaculate, and the smile on her face was both brilliant and ice-cold. She held her phone to her ear, and even from this distance, I could hear the high, dramatic pitch of her voice carrying on the morning air. "Yes, 911 dispatch," she said, a manufactured tremor in her voice. "I'm at 124 Oak Haven Drive. There's a man. He's barricaded himself in his home and he's threatening us. We're just trying to peacefully enforce community bylaws. He's a veteran, and I'm afraid he might be unstable, possibly armed. Please, you have to send someone quickly." The lie slid from her lips as easily as breath. Every word a calculated knife twisted in my reputation. Unstable, armed. She was painting me as a monster, a menace, to justify this outrage. 2 police cruisers, their lights flashing silently in the early mist, were already parked at the end of the street, blocking the road. They weren't approaching, just observing. They were her pawns, and I was the target. All of this entire nightmare, for a small guest house, a sanctuary built of love and memory. Looking at Alicia's triumphant smile, I didn't feel fear. I just felt a cold, steel-hard anger. She had made a fatal miscalculation. She thought she was dealing with a tired, easily intimidated old vet. She had no idea she had just declared war on a lawyer who had spent his life fighting for the downtrodden. And she certainly had no idea that her every word, her every action, was being recorded, not just by the tiny security camera over my door, but by eyes she could never have imagined. Her performance was perfect, but she didn't know she was just an actor in a much, much larger play, and the curtain was about to come down. It wasn't always like this. 2 years ago, Maplewood Hills was paradise. When my wife, Sarah, and I first drove through the oak-lined streets, we knew we'd found home. The air smelled clean, of cut grass and honeysuckle. The houses were immaculate but individual, not the soulless cookie-cutter copies of so many new developments. Neighbors waved to each other over white picket fences, and kids played on lush green lawns until the streetlights flickered on. It was the postcard version of the American dream, a place to heal. I needed that peace. After 20 years in the Army, with tours in places where sand and cordite were the air you breathed, the tranquility of Maplewood Hills was a balm. I'd retired a colonel, with a few scars and a heavy heart. But Sarah, she was the real soldier. She fought cancer with a grace and courage that humbled me, a man trained for war. She never complained. Even on the worst days, she found light. And she was the one who found this place. "Look, Austin," she'd said, her voice weak but her eyes bright as we sat on the back porch swing of the house we were considering. "It has such a big backyard. Big enough for a garden, and big enough for something else." It was then that she planted the seed of the idea. "You know," she continued, resting her head on my shoulder, "when you were away, I read so many stories about the soldiers who come home, about how hard it is for them to transition. They need a safe harbor, a place to just breathe before they can face the world again." Her idea was simple and beautiful. We would build a small guest house in the backyard, not for rental income, but as a temporary, free sanctuary for veterans who needed a place to get their feet back under them, a landing pad, as she called it, for my brothers and sisters in arms. It became her project, her final passion. She sketched designs on napkins, picked out paint colors, and dreamed of evenings spent sitting with young soldiers, just listening to their stories. Sarah passed away before the first brick was laid, but I kept my promise. I used a portion of our life savings, hired the best contractors, and made sure every single city code was followed to the letter. I had permits for everything from the foundation to the plumbing. The guest house, with its 1 bedroom, 1 bath, and small kitchen, stood as a quiet monument to her love and compassion. It was painted the slate blue she'd loved, with crisp white trim and a pot of red geraniums, her favorite, always on the front step. In its first year, it had been home to 3 different vets, a young Marine struggling with PTSD, a female Army medic waiting for her VA benefits to clear, and an older army grunt trying to reconnect with his family. It was working, just as Sarah had dreamed. It was a beacon, and the community embraced it. Neighbors brought over casseroles and words of encouragement. They understood. They were respectful. That was the kind of community Maplewood Hills was, until Alicia Thomas moved in. She arrived like a quiet storm, with a blindingly white BMW and a smile that had been polished by 1,000 real estate deals in California. She and her husband, a silent investor type with shifty eyes, bought the biggest house at the end of the cul-de-sac, the one with the faux Roman columns and a lawn that looked like it was maintained with nail scissors. At first, she was charming. She brought baked goods to her new neighbors, hosted lavish cocktail parties, and made a point of remembering everyone's name. She spoke of community spirit and protecting our property values, benign-sounding words that held a sinister undertone. She quickly joined the HOA board, a sleepy group of 3 retirees who were content to organize the annual Christmas decoration contest and remind people to mow their lawns. Alicia, with her relentless energy and glossy PowerPoint presentations, overwhelmed them. Within 6 months, she'd maneuvered a special election to modernize the leadership. She went door to door, shaking hands, smiling her crocodile smile, and promising a new era of efficiency and excellence for Maplewood Hills. High standards create high value, she'd say, her personal mantra. Many people were captivated. They saw a strong leader, someone who would ensure their biggest investment, their home, was secure. I didn't vote for her. There was something in her eyes, a flat, hungry void, a naked desire for control that set my teeth on edge. But I was in the minority. Alicia won in a landslide. And then, the changes began. Slowly at first. An email about clarifying the regulations on trash receptacles. A memo about approved exterior paint colors. Small things. But then the tone hardened. Compliance is mandatory, not optional. The monthly compliance walks started, with Alicia circling the neighborhood in her golf cart, armed with an iPad and a measuring tape, documenting every perceived infraction. The atmosphere began to shift. The easygoing friendliness was replaced by a low-grade anxiety. Neighbors started eyeing each other with suspicion. Was my birdbath in violation? Was that tiny crack in my driveway going to earn me a fine? Alicia was sowing fear, and she was reaping power. I tried to stay out of it. I followed the rules. My lawn was manicured. My fence was painted. I believed that if I didn't make trouble, trouble wouldn't find me. But I'd forgotten a fundamental rule of warfare. Tyrants are never satisfied. They always need a new enemy, a new conquest. And then, one Tuesday afternoon, the first letter arrived. It sat in my mailbox, a crisp, cream-colored envelope with the HOA logo embossed in gold. Inside was an official notice. It stated that my guest house was in violation of a newly passed bylaw, Article 14, Section C. All auxiliary structures must be aesthetically harmonious with the main residence, including roofing style and exterior materials. It claimed the shingle roof of the guest house did not match the tile roof of my main home. It demanded that I have the entire roof replaced within 30 days or face a fine of $200 per day. I stood there, in the afternoon sun, reading the letter over and over. It was absurd. The house had been there for 2 years without issue. Where had this rule come from? And then I saw it. At the bottom of the page, the flourishing signature of Alicia Thomas, her title, Board President, printed in bold beneath it. It wasn't a reminder. It was a shot across the bow. And I knew, with a heavy certainty in my gut, that my paradise was about to become a battlefield. That letter wasn't just a piece of paper. It was a challenge, a gauntlet thrown down. Standing there in my quiet kitchen, with the late afternoon sun spilling across the hardwood floors, I felt a disturbingly familiar sensation rise from the depths of my memory. It was the sharp-edged calm that comes just before an ambush, the heightened focus when the rules of engagement suddenly change. Alicia Thomas had made a fundamental tactical error. She had underestimated her opponent and revealed her intent far too early. My first response wasn't anger, but the cold analysis of an attorney. I went to my office, a room lined with leather-bound books and mementos from a military career. I pulled out a thick binder labeled Maplewood Hills, Closing Documents. Inside was a copy of every paper I'd signed, every survey map, and most importantly, a copy of the HOA's covenants, conditions, and restrictions, CC, rupees, as they existed at the time of my home purchase. I spent the next hour poring over the document, line by line, a yellow highlighter in hand. I read it front to back, and then I read it again. Nothing. There wasn't a single word about aesthetic roofing harmony or any Article 14, Section C. The rule she was citing simply did not exist in the legally binding document I had agreed to. This meant one of two things. Either the rule had been legally amended after I moved in, or Alicia was fabricating it out of whole cloth. Either possibility opened a difficult path, but knowing the terrain is the first step to winning any battle. The anger came later, a slow, controlled burn. Anger not for myself, but for Sarah. That guest house was her legacy. It was the physical embodiment of her kindness. And this woman, with her expensive pantsuits and hollow soul, dared to use bureaucratic lies to profane that memory. She wasn't just attacking my property, she was attacking my sanctuary. Alicia's reign of terror began in earnest the following week. She seemed to take my initial silence as a sign of weakness, an invitation to escalate her campaign. Her first targets were the Millers, David and Eleanor, a couple in their 80s who lived across the street from me. David was a retired history teacher, a gentleman with garden soil under his fingernails, and a collection of worn tweed caps. Eleanor, who battled arthritis, spent most of her days in an armchair by the window, but her great joy was their rose garden. It wasn't just a rose garden, it was a living work of art, the result of 20 years of devoted care. The roses had names like Peace, Mr. Lincoln, and Queen Elizabeth, and they bloomed in a riot of color that was the envy of the neighborhood. One Thursday morning, I saw Alicia's golf cart screech to a halt in front of their house. She emerged, iPad held like a weapon, and confronted David, who was weeding among his rose bushes. Their conversation, muffled by the distance, looked tense. David kept shaking his head, gesturing to his flowers. Alicia just tapped on her iPad screen, the smile never leaving her face but her eyes as cold as stone. Then, she pivoted and drove away. Later that day, I went to check on David. I found him sitting on his front steps, shoulders slumped, holding a piece of paper. It was an official violation notice. Alicia had cited a vague bylaw regarding native flora, claiming their hybrid tea roses were not on the HOA's approved plant list and therefore had to be removed within 14 days. She said they were a visual blight, David said, his voice hoarse with disbelief. Eleanor, she's been crying all morning. These roses are her world. Some of them are older than our grandchildren. My gut clenched. This wasn't about maintaining standards. This was pure, unadulterated cruelty. It was a power play, designed to show everyone that nothing, no matter how sentimental or personal, was sacred. The next target was Carla Diaz, a single mother and nurse who lived down the block. Carla worked 12-hour shifts at the county hospital, raising 2 young children on grit and coffee. Her small backyard was their kingdom, home to a faded green plastic slide and a turtle-shaped sandbox. It wasn't a magazine-worthy playground, but it was a place of safety and joy. Alicia timed her attack perfectly. She arrived on a Monday evening just as Carla was getting home from a grueling shift, still in her scrubs. I was watering my front lawn and could hear Alicia's razor-sharp voice carrying over the fence. She was informing Carla that permanent play structures were forbidden by a new regulation, and the sandbox was an unsightly nuisance that could attract vermin. "I don't understand," I heard Carla say, her voice thick with fatigue. "It's been there since we moved in. The kids love it. Rules are rules, Miss Diaz," Alicia replied, her tone syrupy, sweet but laced with steel. "We can't make exceptions simply because it's convenient. It brings down everyone's property values. You have 1 week to remove them." Carla didn't argue. She was too exhausted to fight. That weekend, I saw her and her 2 small children, a boy and a girl, dismantling the slide. The kids were crying, silent tears tracking paths down their dusty cheeks as they watched their parent pack away a piece of their childhood. I walked over and offered to help, but Carla just shook her head, her eyes a mixture of shame and resignation. "Thanks, Austin," she said quietly. It's easier to comply." It was then I realized Alicia's plan was more insidious than I'd thought. She wasn't just targeting property, she was targeting morale. She was making good, hard-working people feel powerless, making them believe that resistance was futile. She was turning neighbors into subjugated subjects. That's when I started my file. In the military, we were taught the importance of intelligence gathering. Knowledge is power, and documentation is ammunition. I bought a black, hardcover notebook and began to log everything. Every sighting of Alicia's golf cart, every rumored violation notice, every fearful conversation by the mailboxes. May 12. Millers receive warning Rose Garden. May 17. Carla Diaz forced to remove playset. May 21. The Kowalski family fined $50 for leaving their trash bins at the curb for more than 3 hours after pickup. The list grew, a chronicle of petty tyranny. I noted dates, times, the neighbors involved, and the nature of the infraction. I took discreet photos with my phone of the Miller's rose garden before it was destroyed, of Carla's empty playset, of the plumber's work truck with a ticket on it for being parked on the street for more than an hour. I was building a case, one piece of evidence at a time. I didn't know exactly what I was fighting yet, but my soldier's instinct told me I needed to be prepared for a long war. The 30 days from my initial notice passed in a tense silence. I did not replace the roof. I did not contact Alicia. I held my ground, waiting for her next move. It came on day 31, not as a warning, but as a bombshell. Another crisp, cream-colored envelope, but this one arrived via certified mail, requiring my signature. Inside was a formal invoice. It was titled Notice of Delinquent Fines. Below was a cold, simple table. Violation. Article 14, Section C, Days in Violation, 30. Daily fine, $200. Total amount due, $6,000. $6,000. The number leaped off the page, preposterous and obscene, but it was the text below that made my blood run cold. It was written in threatening legalese, designed to shock and awe. It spoke of the right to place a lien on the property, foreclosure proceedings, and liability for all legal fees incurred. This was no longer a dispute about roofing shingles. This was extortion, masquerading as community governance. Alicia was trying to rob me, using the HOA as her weapon. She had crossed a line. She had taken this from a matter of principle to a fight for survival. Holding the invoice in my hand, I looked out the window at the guest house, standing solid and peaceful in the shade of the oak tree. It was my promise to Sarah. And there wasn't a petty tyrant in the world, with her fabricated rules and her empty threats, who was going to make me break it. The game was well and truly on. Alicia thought she had me cornered, but all she had done was wake up the soldier, and that soldier had just received his marching orders. The $6,000 invoice lay on my desk like a pulled-pin grenade. Any normal person would have felt panic, a cold wave of fear at the legalistic jargon and the impossible number. But I wasn't a normal person. I had spent 20 years in a profession where making decisions under pressure was a prerequisite for survival. Panic was a luxury you couldn't afford when other people's lives depended on you. So, I did what I was trained to do. I compartmentalized my emotions, analyzed the threat, and prepared a methodical counteroffensive. Alicia wanted a paper war? Fine. I was more at home on that terrain than I was in any jungle. I spent that evening in my office, not fuming, but drafting. My laptop cast a soft blue glow in the dark room, the steady click of my keyboard, the only sound breaking the silence. I didn't write an angry letter. Anger is a poor tactic. It clouds judgment. Instead, I composed a formal legal document, a demand for verification and cease and desist of harassing actions. Its language was coldly polite, surgically precise. I began by acknowledging receipt of their invoice. Then, I gently pointed out the discrepancy. I quoted, verbatim, the copy of the HOACC, ours, I received at my closing, stating clearly that no such Article 14, Section C existed in that binding document. I wrote, per my records, the governing documents in effect at the time of my property acquisition contain no restrictions regarding the aesthetic harmony of roofing materials between a primary residence and auxiliary structures. In order to clarify this matter and ensure that all parties are acting on accurate information, I hereby formally request that the board provide me with the following documentation within 10 business days of receipt of this letter. My list of demands was specific and designed to corner her. I requested a dated copy of the covenant amendment containing Article 14, Section C. I requested the official minutes of the board meeting where this amendment was proposed, discussed, and voted upon. I requested a record of that vote, including the tally for and against, and, most critically, I requested proof that all homeowners in the community had been properly notified of the proposed meeting and vote, as required by the HOA's own bylaws. My letter was a carefully constructed trap. If the rule was legitimate, she'd be able to produce the documents easily. If it was fraudulent, she wouldn't be able to. By demanding proof, I was shifting the burden from me to her. I ended the letter with a tone of false conciliation, stating that I was eager to resolve this apparent misunderstanding amicably, but also subtly adding that all fines and punitive actions related to this matter are hereby disputed and considered void until such time as this verification is complete. The next morning, I sent it via certified mail with a return receipt requested, ensuring I had undeniable proof she had received it. Now, all I had to do was wait. The wait wasn't long. Alicia was an impatient person, a character trait that often leads to mistakes in those who believe they are smarter than everyone else. Exactly 1 week later, a thick, large HOA envelope appeared in my mailbox. Her speedy response told me I'd struck a nerve. Inside wasn't a letter, but a stapled packet of documents. The first page was a cover letter from Alicia. Its tone had shifted from faux professionalism to undisguised condescension. "Mr. Bailey," it began, "in response to your request, please find the enclosed documents substantiating the valid passage of Article 14, Section C. Perhaps in the future, you should spend more time keeping up with community regulations and less time lodging baseless legal challenges." It was a sneer, the overconfidence of someone who believed she had won. Behind the letter was what she believed to be her trump card, a copy of the minutes of the special meeting of the Maplewood Hills HOA Board of Directors, dated 18 months prior. The document looked official. It had the HOA logo at the top, and it was formatted like a real set of minutes. It described a discussion about preserving the aesthetic integrity of the community, and culminated in a recorded vote of 3-0 to adopt the addition of Article 14, Section C to the covenants. Everything looked to be in order, but something felt wrong. The font was slightly different from older HOA documents I had. The language seemed too polished, too defensive, as if it were written to prove a point rather than to record an event. And then I saw it, at the bottom of the page, 3 signatures. 2 I didn't recognize, presumably belonging to the hand-picked, pliable board members Alicia had installed. But the third signature, next to the title Board Secretary, was a name I knew well: Eleanor Gable. Mrs. Gable had been the HOA secretary for nearly a decade before Alicia's reign. She was a widow in her late 70s, a respected and beloved figure who had stepped down for health reasons shortly after Alicia was elected. Her signature looked about right, an elegant, somewhat shaky cursive, but it was the shakiness that gave me pause. It looked performed. It didn't look like the writing of an elderly person, but like someone's imitation of the writing of an elderly person. A deep sense of unease settled over me. This was the piece that didn't fit. Mrs. Gable lived in a small cottage on the other side of the neighborhood, a home surrounded by azaleas and a perfect white picket fence. I decided to pay her a visit, not as a lawyer on a mission, but as a concerned neighbor. I brought a basket of blueberry muffins I'd baked that morning, a tactic Sarah had taught me could open most doors. Mrs. Gable answered the door, her face breaking into a warm smile when she saw me. "Austin, dear," she said, wiping her hands on her floral apron. "What a lovely surprise." Her home smelled of lavender and old books, a cozy, lived-in space. We sat in her sun-drenched living room, surrounded by black and white photos of her late husband in his army uniform, and color photos of children and grandchildren. After a few minutes of small talk about the weather in her garden, I gently steered the conversation. "Mrs. Gable, I hope you don't mind my asking," I began, pulling the document packet from my briefcase. "I'm trying to clear up some HOA business, and your name came up on a recent document. I just wanted to make sure it was all correct." I handed her the copy of the meeting minutes. She slipped on her reading glasses, which perched on the end of her nose, and examined the paper. A silence fell over the room as she read. Her smile slowly faded, replaced by a look of confusion. Then, her brow furrowed. She stared at the signature at the bottom of the page for a long time. "Oh, my," she whispered, her voice barely more than a breath. She looked up at me, and in her eyes, I saw an emotion that made my heart sink. Fear. "Austin," she said, her voice trembling slightly, "this isn't my signature." She pointed to the date at the top of the document. "You see this, dear? This is dated for June of last year. I resigned from the board in April. I wasn't even at this meeting, if it ever really happened." She traced her trembling finger over the forged signature. "And this, someone has tried to copy my signature from old papers. But they got it wrong. My arthritis, it's in my hands, you see. I can't sign my name this smoothly anymore. My script is much shakier." The plot twist had landed, not with a bang, but with a frightened whisper in a sunlit living room. This was no longer an abuse of power or an overzealous enforcement of a bylaw. This was fraud, forgery, a crime. Alicia Thomas hadn't just bent the rules. She had committed a felony. She had forged a legal document and used the postal system to deliver it to me for the purpose of financial extortion. The sense of unease I'd felt had crystallized into ice-cold certainty. I was no longer dealing with a neighborhood bully. I was dealing with an actual criminal, and I was holding the irrefutable proof in my hand. I thanked Mrs. Gable, assuring her that I would handle it and that she would not be involved. As I left her cozy home and stepped back out into the harsh sunlight, the world seemed to have shifted on its axis. This fight had just become infinitely more dangerous. But at the same time, for the first time since this all began, I knew, with absolute certainty, that I was going to win. Leaving Mrs. Gable's house, the forged document in my hand felt both heavy and powerful. It was heavy with the deceit it represented, the corruption that had seeped into our quiet community. But it was also a weapon, a blade of truth that could slice through the web of lies Alicia had woven. My military mind kicked into gear, shifting from defensive posture to strategic offensive planning. Rule number 1 of asymmetrical warfare: never fight alone. A single man can be dismissed as a troublemaker, a malcontent, but a group of organized citizens, united by a common cause, that was an insurgency. I knew exactly who my first recruits needed to be. They weren't soldiers in the traditional sense, but they were on the front lines of this war, having already felt the first shots of Alicia's tyranny. My first stop was the Millers. I found David in his front yard, mournfully pulling up the last of Eleanor's rose bushes, the blooms wilted on a pile of dead sticks. The sight was a gut punch. It was the very picture of defeat, of capitulation to a bully. I didn't knock on the door. I just walked right up to him, carrying a pitcher of cold lemonade and 2 glasses. We sat for a moment in silence on the porch steps. The weak snip of David's pruning shears the only sound. "I'm sorry about your roses, David," I said quietly. He sighed, a heavy, rattling sound. "It's not the roses, Austin. It's Eleanor. She won't even look out the window anymore. It's like she stole a piece of her sunshine." That was my opening. I didn't lead with the forgery. That would be too jarring, too shocking. I led with solidarity. I told him about the guest house, about the first letter, and then I showed him the $6,000 invoice. His eyes went wide. "Good Lord," he whispered. "The woman is mad." "It's worse than mad, David," I said. "It's criminal." And then I showed him the copy of the forged meeting minutes. I explained my visit to Mrs. Gable, the impossible date, the fake signature. As I spoke, I saw a change come over David's gentle face. The resignation fell away, replaced by a cold fire in his eyes. The history teacher in him recognized the pattern of tyranny. Eleanor came to the door, having heard our voices. She looked pale and fragile, but as David explained what I had just revealed, her shoulders straightened. "I knew it," she said. Her voice, though frail, rang with steel. I knew something wasn't right. What kind of person destroys an old woman's flowers? They were in. That evening, their motivation was pure. They wanted their sunshine back, they wanted their dignity, and they didn't want anyone else to suffer the cruelty they had endured. Recruiting Carla Diaz was harder. She was a lone wolf by necessity, a single parent wearing the hats of both mother and father, with no time or energy for battles. I knew that approaching her with legal documents and tales of conspiracy would only scare her off. So, I took a different tack. I waited until an evening when I saw her car pull in, close to 8 o'clock. I walked over, carrying a hot casserole dish of lasagna I'd made. "Figured you might not have time to cook tonight," I said, offering it to her. The exhaustion was etched on her face, but she managed a grateful smile. "Austin, you shouldn't have." "It's what neighbors do," I replied. She invited me in. The house was small, clean, but cluttered with the happy chaos of children's toys. We sat at her small kitchen table while her kids watched television in the living room. I let her talk first. She vented about her job, about the kids, and finally, about the feeling of helplessness and anger she felt toward Alicia. "I feel so stupid," she confessed, her voice trailing off. I took it down. I let her intimidate me. "You weren't stupid, Carla," I said firmly. "You were a mother protecting your kids from trouble. That's the smartest thing anyone can do." Only after she felt heard and validated did I present my case. I told her about the Millers, about myself, and about the forgery. I didn't ask her to lead a charge. I asked her to join us. "We can't let her keep doing this to people," I said. "Think about the next family she targets. Another single mom, another elderly couple. We have a chance to stop it." She was quiet for a long time, staring into her now cold plate of lasagna. I could see the battle in her eyes. Fear versus outrage. The instinct for self-preservation versus the desire for justice. Finally, she looked up, and I saw a new spark in her tired eyes. "What can I do?" she asked. Her motivation was forged in empathy, a resolve to ensure no one else would have to feel as isolated and powerless as she had. Our unlikely alliance was formed. Our first war council took place on Saturday night in my office. The scene was surreal. Me, the retired colonel, David, the gentle academic, Eleanor, the dignified matriarch with a keen eye, and Carla, the exhausted but determined nurse. We were the very picture of the people Alicia considered weak and dismissible. That was our greatest strength. I spread a large map of the Maplewood Hills subdivision across my conference table. Then, I laid out all my evidence. My logbook detailing the violations, the photographs, copies of my correspondence with the HOA, and finally, with a flourish, the forged meeting minutes. David put on his glasses and examined the document intently. "The prose, the syntax," he muttered. "It doesn't have the rhythm of a real bureaucratic document. It's too smooth." Too self-satisfied. Eleanor pointed to another detail. Mrs. Gable always used cream-colored paper for the official minutes. This is too white. Carla, with her practical eye, saw the bigger picture. All of us, she said softly. All the people she's gone after. What do we have in common? The question hung in the air. I took a red marker and began to circle the affected houses on the map. Mine, the Millers, Carla's, the Kowalski family. Then, David mentioned 2 other families who had complained about petty fines. I circled them too. A pattern began to emerge, faint at first, then alarmingly clear. The Millers' house is on the largest corner lot in this section, I thought aloud. It could easily be subdivided. My house, Carla added, backs right up against the greenbelt. It's one of the few properties with direct access. And mine, I concluded, has a legal accessory dwelling unit. That adds significant value to it. Each targeted property wasn't random. Each one had a unique attribute that made it more valuable than average. A larger lot, a premium location, a grandfathered-in feature. And the owners? An elderly couple, a single mother, a man living alone, others who were struggling financially. We were all vulnerable in some way. This isn't about power, David said, his voice low with the weight of the discovery. And it's not about enforcing rules. This is about real estate. She's trying to force us out. The room fell silent as the horrifying truth of the situation settled in. This wasn't an overzealous HOA. This was a calculated property acquisition scheme. Alicia wasn't a bully. She was a predator, picking off the weakest members of the herd. That discovery changed everything. It elevated our fight from a resistance to a criminal investigation. We ended the meeting with a clear plan of action. Phase 1 was more intelligence gathering. Each of us would become a neighborhood operative, discreetly talking to our neighbors, gathering more stories of Alicia's harassment, documenting every fine, every threat. We needed to understand the true scale of her operation. Phase 2 was to continue the legal fight. I would remain the tip of the spear, but now I had testimony and support. Phase 3, and the most crucial, was to operate in complete secrecy. Alicia could not know we were organized. She needed to continue to believe we were isolated victims, too afraid to fight back. When they left that night, there was a new energy in the air. Fear had been replaced by purpose. Isolation had been replaced by solidarity. We weren't individual victims anymore. We were an alliance. An unlikely one, perhaps, but one bound by a shared belief that a home was more than just wood and brick, and that it was a place where dignity and peace had to be defended at all costs. The weeks following our first war council were an exercise in patience and secrecy. On the surface, everything in Maplewood Hills continued as normal. Alicia carried on with her golf cart patrols, a petty queen in her suburban kingdom, documenting minor infractions with a radiant smile. She seemed not to notice the shift. She didn't see how David Miller, while tending his garden, now engaged neighbors in long, quiet conversations about property values. She didn't see how Carla Diaz, at the community playground, had become a sympathetic ear for other mothers who shared stories of HOA, fine letters, and threats. Each member of our small alliance had become an intelligence node. Eleanor, with her long-standing bridge club network, heard whispers of families who had quietly sold and moved away in the past year, worn down by the constant harassment. Carla gathered stories of unexplained special assessment fees and suddenly shifting rules. David methodically logged every contractor's van, every landscaper's truck that got a ticket. They brought these scraps of information to me in brief, discreet encounters, a folded note passed while getting the mail, a whispered conversation behind the produce aisle at the grocery store. The picture we were assembling was disturbing. The scale of Alicia's operation was much larger than we'd imagined. At least a dozen families had been targeted to varying degrees, but it was all hearsay. We had anecdotes, we had suspicion, but we had no hard proof. I knew that to take down someone like Alicia, I needed something irrefutable, something that would stand up in a court of law. And in battles like these, the most powerful weapon is always to follow the money. Late one night, long after the other houses on the block had gone dark, I sat in my office, the only light coming from my computer monitor and a small desk lamp. This was my battlefield now. Instead of topographical maps, I had public databases. Instead of scout reports, I had legal filings. My mission: to find out who was profiting from the misery spreading through Maplewood Hills. I started with a name David had given me, the Kowalski family. They were a young couple. He was an electrician who had been fined into oblivion for parking his work van in his own driveway. They had sold their house 6 months ago for far below market value, according to neighbors, just to get out. Accessing the county's property records was a tedious process. The government website looked like it had been designed in the 90 seconds, slow and clunky. But I persisted. I searched for the Kowalskis' address, and there it was, the deed of transfer. I clicked on the scanned document. Their names were listed as the grantors, but it was the grantee's name that made my blood run cold. It wasn't a family. It was a soulless, corporate name, Maplewood Redevelopment LLC. An LLC, a limited liability company, a common vehicle for obscuring the true identity of the owners. More alarming was the sale price. It was at least $100,000 below the home's estimated value. They had been squeezed out for pennies on the dollar. A jolt of adrenaline shot through me. This was it. This was the missing piece. I started a new search, this time for any other real estate transactions in Maplewood Hills in the last 2 years involving an LLC. The results trickled in. There were 2 more. One house had belonged to an elderly widow who passed away, and her out-of-state heirs had sold it quickly. The buyer, Maplewood Redevelopment LLC. The price, criminally low. The third was an HOA-initiated foreclosure on a young military family who had fallen on hard times after the husband was injured overseas and couldn't work. The house was sold at auction on the courthouse steps. The only bidder present? A representative from Maplewood Redevelopment LLC. The price, just enough to cover the debts. A clear, cold, and vicious pattern was emerging. Alicia wasn't just making people's lives miserable. She was creating a supply chain of cut-rate properties for a mysterious entity. Now I had the monster's name. The next step was to rip off its mask. Every LLC registered in the state has to have a public file with the Secretary of State's office. I navigated to another database, my heart beating faster now. I typed Maplewood Redevelopment LLC into the search bar and hit enter. The result was immediate. The company was formed 20 months ago, just 2 months after Alicia was elected HOA president. Coincidence. The registered address was a P.O. box in a neighboring town, a dead end designed to frustrate. But the law requires every LLC to have a registered agent, a physical person or company, responsible for receiving legal papers. And there, listed in simple, sans serif font, was a name, Daniel Hart. The name meant nothing to me. It was aggressively normal, but it was a thread. I ran another search, this time in the state's contractor licensing database for the name Daniel Hart. A single result popped up, Daniel Dan Hart, a licensed demolition contractor. And his company name was listed right next to it, Hart's Demolition. The name hit me like a physical blow. It was the name crudely painted on the side of the white pickup truck parked outside my house that fateful morning, the one that accompanied the bulldozer. The man who owned the demolition company hired to tear down my house was also the principal behind the Shell Corporation, buying up distressed properties in my neighborhood. The connection was terrifying and undeniable, but there was still one final piece missing, the link between Daniel Hart and Alicia Thomas. Why would a demolition contractor be in league with a corrupt HOA president? My gut knew the answer, but I needed proof. I turned from official databases to a much more powerful and disturbing investigative tool, social media. A simple search for Alicia Thomas brought me to her Facebook page. It was surprisingly public, a carefully curated stage for her perfect life. There were photos of her at ribbon cuttings, pictures from neighborhood charity events, and endless selfies showing off her expensive business attire. I started scrolling back, going back in time through her digital life. And then I found it, a post from about a year ago. It was a photo from a backyard barbecue. Alicia stood there, beaming her signature fake smile, a glass of white wine in one hand. Her other arm was slung around a big, beefy man in a green polo shirt who was grinning at the camera. Underneath the photo was a short, cheerful caption. So proud of my little brother Danny for all his success. Number family, number entrepreneur. The man in the photo was Daniel Hart, her brother. My world screeched to a halt. All the pieces clicked into place with a sickening finality. This wasn't just a partnership. This was a family operation, a perfectly coordinated conspiracy. Alicia, with the power of the HOA, was the tip of the spear. She terrorized homeowners, created fraudulent debt, and made their lives unbearable, forcing them to sell or face foreclosure. Then her brother, Daniel, through his shell company, would swoop in like a vulture and acquire the properties for a fraction of their worth. They weren't just bending the rules. They were running an organized racket, stealing the equity and security of their own neighbors. I leaned back in my chair, a chill running down my spine. The ruthlessness of it, the calculation, was breathtaking. They had weaponized the American dream for their own greed. I stared at the picture on the screen, the sister's brilliant smile and the brother's goofy grin, 2 sharks in neighbors' clothing. I had my proof. I had the entire conspiracy laid out before me. But this knowledge carried a new weight. This fight could no longer be won with stern letters or community meetings. I was up against a criminal enterprise, and I knew I was going to need much bigger guns to take them down. The evidence on my computer screen was both a vindication and a burden. I had been right. This whole thing was an elaborate scheme, but that knowledge came with a chilling truth. I was critically outgunned. This was no longer one citizen versus an overreaching HOA. This was a few ordinary neighbors against a methodical and ruthless family crime operation. Sending Alicia another legal letter now seemed dangerously naive, like trying to put out a house fire with a squirt gun. They were already committing mail fraud and forgery, crimes that carried prison time. People with that much to lose don't back down easily. They fight dirty. They escalate. The safety of the Millers, of Carla and her kids, of myself, was now a very real concern. I sat in my office until the early hours of the morning, my sense of triumph having evaporated, replaced by the weight of responsibility. I needed a bigger weapon. I needed an ally who could fight this kind of crime on its own level. My mind ran through a Rolodex of contacts, and then it landed on a name, a face from another lifetime. Mark Riley. We'd been through officer candidate school together, two young guys full of piss and vinegar. I'd gone infantry, and he, with his sharp intellect and unnatural calm, had been recruited into military intelligence. The last I'd spoken to him was nearly a decade ago, at a mutual friend's wedding. He told me he'd left the Army and joined a different one, the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Finding him wasn't hard. A few calls to old Army buddies got me his personal cell number, but making that call was one of the hardest things I'd ever done. It felt like an admission of defeat, of being in over my head. But pride was a luxury I couldn't afford. I dialed, my heart hammering in my chest. He answered on the second ring. Riley. His voice was the same, clipped and no nonsense. Mark, I said, it's Austin Bailey. There was a short pause. Bailey, he said, a hint of warmth entering his tone. Well, there's a name from the past. You still making trouble somewhere in the world, Colonel? I managed a weak laugh. Not overseas anymore. This time it's on the home front. Listen, Mark, I know it's been a long time, but I'm in a situation. It's complicated. It's gotten bigger than me. And I think it might be in your wheelhouse. I gave him the most condensed version I could, skipping the roses and the playsets, and focusing on the key points, the systematic harassment, the fabricated fines, the foreclosures, and finally, the shell company run by the HOA president's brother. I tried to keep my voice calm, presenting the facts like an intel briefing, not a plea for help. Mark listened without interrupting. When I was done, he was quiet for a moment. You got any proof, Austin? Or is this all neighborly speculation? He asked, his professional FBI agent tone having completely replaced the old camaraderie. I've got it all, I replied. I've got the forged meeting minutes, I've got the corporate filings, I've got the property deeds, I've got the family photo. I have a complete chain of evidence. There was another pause, this one longer. I could hear the faint sound of him typing on a keyboard on the other end. Maplewood Redevelopment LLC, he said, not as a question, but as a confirmation. All right, Austin, you have my attention. We need to meet. We met 2 days later at a highway diner, an anonymous place halfway between my city and his field office. The place smelled of burnt coffee and bacon, and the booth seats were cracked red vinyl. It was the perfect place to be invisible. Mark looked different. His sandy blonde hair now had silver at the temples, and there were lines around his eyes that hadn't been there before. But his eyes were the same, blue, piercing, and missing nothing. He was dressed in a simple polo shirt and jeans, looking more like a suburban dad running errands than a federal agent. We ordered coffee, and after a few minutes of clumsy small talk about our families and the old days, I laid my file on the table between the salt and pepper shakers. This is everything, I said. For the next 20 minutes, I walked him through the whole sordid story, starting with the first letter about my roof and ending with the Facebook family photo. I showed him my logbook, the pictures, the documents. He examined each piece of paper with an unwavering focus, his silence more intimidating than any questions could have been. He flipped through the pages of my notebook, pausing on the entries about the Millers and Carla Diaz. He studied the forged minutes under the dim diner light, comparing it to the other legitimate HOA documents I'd brought. He tapped his finger on the LLC filings, then on the family photo of Alicia and Daniel Hart. When I finished, he said nothing. He just sat there, staring at the papers spread out between us, a map of greed and deceit. His professional silence was unnerving. Maybe I'd overestimated this. Maybe this was just some small-time scam the Bureau couldn't be bothered with. So what do you think? I finally asked, unable to take the silence anymore. Mark looked up, his eyes locking onto mine. He didn't smile. I think you've stepped in a much bigger snake pit than you realize, Austin. He reached for his briefcase, set it on the seat beside him, and pulled out a thin file of his own. He slid it across the table toward me. The name Maplewood Redevelopment LLC rang a bell when you called, he said. It's been on our radar for a few months. We just didn't know where it was nesting. I opened the file. Inside were surveillance photos. One showed a nondescript warehouse in an industrial part of the city. Another showed men unloading high-end air conditioning units and spools of copper wire from an unmarked truck in the middle of the night. And then I saw a photo that made me catch my breath. It was a long-lens shot, slightly grainy, of one of the foreclosed homes in Maplewood Hills, the one that had belonged to the young military family. Hart's demolition truck was parked in the driveway, but they weren't demolishing anything. They were carefully removing planks of hardwood flooring and double-paned windows, stacking them neatly in the back of their truck. This isn't just real estate fraud, Austin, Mark said, his voice low and serious. That's just the entry point. We've been tracking a statewide, organized construction materials theft ring for almost a year. They hit construction sites and supply warehouses for high-value items, appliances, lumber, wiring, fixtures. We estimate they've moved millions in stolen goods. He pointed at the surveillance photo. This was our missing piece. This is how they're laundering the supply. They aren't just flipping these houses, they're stripping them. Daniel Hart and his crew get legal access to the home through his sister's HOA scheme. Then they go in and gut the place of everything valuable before selling the empty shell as a fixer-upper. The entire profit from the stolen materials and the legitimate materials they're taking from these homes is pure black market cash. It's a remarkably sophisticated operation. I sat there, stunned. My case. My little fight over a guest house and some rose bushes had just collided with a multi-million-dollar federal criminal enterprise. Alicia wasn't just a con artist. She was a key player in a much larger criminal machine. My naivete was embarrassing. I'd thought I was fighting a tiger shark, when in reality, I'd inadvertently poked a great white. The danger had just magnified tenfold. These people wouldn't stop at threatening letters. They had far too much to lose. We knew about Hart, Mark continued. We suspected he was one of the ringleaders, but we could never connect him to the initial property acquisitions. His sister, she's the feeder. She identifies the targets and creates the legal leverage to force them out. Christ, it's perfect. He leaned forward, his voice dropping lower. This is a major federal case, Austin, but we have a problem. We can get Hart with the stolen goods, but it's very hard to prove the HOA fraud conspiracy without a witness on the inside. It's hard to tie him to his sister definitively in court. He let those words hang in the heavy diner air. He was giving me an out, and at the same time, making me an offer. This is bigger than your guest house, he said. We need someone on the inside, someone they trust is a victim, someone who can bait them into a trap. Are you willing to help us take the whole network down? The question hung between us, more critical than any I'd ever faced on a battlefield. The choice was clear. Back off and let the FBI handle it, hoping for the best for my own safety. Or step up, become the bait, and finish the war I had started. Looking at the surveillance photos, at the faces of the predators who were destroying my community from the inside out, I knew there really wasn't any choice at all. The air in the diner seemed to thicken, filled with the smell of cheap coffee and the weight of the question Mark had asked. Are you willing to help us? It wasn't just a question. It was an invitation to step through a one-way door, from a citizen seeking justice to an asset in a federal sting operation. There was no hesitation. In the military, when you see a threat to your unit, you engage. You don't back down. Alicia and her brother were a threat not just to me, but to my entire community, my new unit. I'm in, I said, my voice steadier than I felt. Tell me what I need to do. A small, almost imperceptible smile touched Mark's lips. It wasn't a smile of humor, but of recognition. He saw the soldier in me, the man who understood that some fights you have to choose. Good, he said, packing away his file, because our plan needs a man on the inside. Welcome to the team, Colonel. Our next meeting was on another level entirely. Mark arranged it in what he called a soft location, a private conference room in the back of a county law library, a place perfectly anonymous and boring. This time, we weren't alone. Seated across from me was a woman in her early 40s, with dark hair pulled back in a severe bun and sharp eyes that looked like they could see through concrete. She wore a tailored charcoal gray suit and radiated an aura of uncompromising efficiency. Mr. Bailey, Mark said, this is Assistant U.S. Attorney Patricia Williams. She's the lead prosecutor on this case. Patricia, this is our man on the ground. Patricia Williams wasted no time on pleasantries. She shook my hand, a firm, brisk grip. Thank you for coming, Mr. Bailey, she said, her voice clear and precise. Mark has shown me your file. It's impressive, but before we go any further, I need to be sure you understand exactly what you are getting into. For the next half hour, she grilled me. Her questions were surgical, probing every aspect of my story, every motivation, every potential weakness. She wanted to know if I had any personal vendettas against Miss Thomas, if I had any financial issues that could be used against me in court. She wasn't being rude, she was being thorough. She was vetting her most important asset, her star witness, to make sure I wouldn't crumble under the pressure of a cross-examination. "This isn't just a fraud case, Mr. Bailey," she explained, her hands steepled on the table. "With the evidence you've provided, combined with our own investigation into Daniel Hart's activities, we believe we have the grounds for a RICO case." RICO, the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, the statute designed to take down mafia families. To hear it invoked in the context of my suburban HOA war was surreal. "We don't just want Alicia Thomas for forgery," she continued. "We want the whole enterprise, the sister, the brother, the complicit board members, the entire distribution network for the stolen materials. To do that, we need incontrovertible evidence that ties them all together. We need to catch them in the act. And that's where you come in." The plan they laid out was both audacious and risky. I was, in essence, to become the bait. My home would become the stage. The first step was for me to deliberately escalate the conflict in a way that would force Alicia's hand. Under Patricia's guidance, I drafted one final letter to the HOA board. This one dispensed with all pretense of civility. It flatly accused the board of engaging in a willful and malicious campaign of harassment. It declared the $6,000 invoice an act of extortion and pronounced Article 14, Section C, a complete fabrication, citing its absence from the original governing documents. I ended the letter with a direct challenge. "Consider this your formal notice that I will not be paying any fraudulent fines, nor will I be making any alterations to my property based on fabricated bylaws. Any attempt to place a lien on my property or enact foreclosure proceedings will be met with the most aggressive legal action possible, to include the pursuit of criminal charges for fraud." It was a calculated declaration of war. "She's a narcissist," Mark had analyzed. "This public defiance will drive her insane. She won't be able to stand being shown up by a victim. She'll need to assert her dominance in a definitive way. She'll order the demolition." The next phase was technical. For 2 consecutive nights, from midnight to 4 a.m., my home was quietly invaded. A team of FBI technicians, dressed in dark clothing and moving with the silent efficiency of ghosts, turned my house into a listening post. They installed microscopic cameras in places I could never have imagined, inside a ceramic garden bird, behind the eye of a plastic fishing gnome, within the security light on my porch. They secreted microphones in the walls and even inside the doorbell. My phone and my computer, with my permission, were set up to record and relay all communications. Living in my own home became a strange experience. My privacy was gone, traded for a greater purpose. Every conversation I had, every email I wrote, was part of the performance. The hardest part was keeping my allies in the dark. I met with David and Carla separately, telling them I was pursuing an aggressive legal strategy, and that for their safety, it was best if they kept their distance for a while. I could see the disappointment in their eyes, but they trusted me. The lie tasted like ash in my mouth, but Patricia had been insistent that keeping them out of the loop was crucial for the integrity of the operation and their own safety. Once the stage was set, all we could do was wait. My defiant letter went out. 10 days later, a final notice of violation arrived, this time demanding an escalated fine of $10,000 and threatening immediate action if it was not paid within 72 hours. I let the deadline pass in silence. The tension in my quiet house was almost a physical presence. Every car that passed, every knock on the door, made me jump. I was living in a state of heightened alert, a feeling I hadn't experienced since my days in Baghdad. Then, on a Thursday morning, Mark called. "She took the bait," he said, his voice calm but with an undercurrent of tension. "We picked up a call between Alicia and her brother. She gave the order. 'Let's be done with this,' she said. 'Show that old man and the whole neighborhood who's in charge. Hart's demolition is scheduled to be at your house tomorrow morning at 8 a.m. She's also notified the local PD that she anticipates a possible conflict and requested their presence." So this was it. The game was on. Patricia called moments later to go over the final instructions. "Remember, Austin, your role is the stubborn but scared veteran. Yell, protest, but never make a physical threat. We need her to be the sole aggressor. We'll be everywhere. Teams will be in place before dawn. You will not be alone for a single second." That night, I didn't sleep. I wandered through my wired house, feeling like an actor waiting in the wings for the performance of a lifetime. I stopped in front of Sarah's picture on the mantle. She was smiling, her eyes alight with joy. I had built that guest house as a promise to her, a place of safety, and now, to protect that promise, I had made it the centerpiece of a trap. I didn't know if she would have approved of my methods, but I knew she would have understood the why. Justice, I whispered to her photograph. Justice, for everyone. As dawn broke, painting the sky in shades of gray and pink, I made a pot of coffee and sat at my kitchen table, in the exact spot I had been when this all began. I waited for the rumble of a diesel engine, knowing that this time I was ready. The stage was set, the players were in position, and the curtain was about to rise on the final act. At 8 a.m. sharp, the rumbling began. It was a low, vibratory sound that started in the distance and grew steadily, like an approaching earthquake. It worked its way through the floorboards, up through my legs, and settled in my chest like a second, menacing heartbeat. I stood at the kitchen window, coffee in hand, playing the part of a man about to lose everything. But inside, every one of my senses was elevated to a state of high alert. I wasn't just hearing a bulldozer. I was hearing the faint, electronic hum of the microphone, hidden in the window frame. I wasn't just seeing the dawn. I was seeing the world through the tiny glass eye of the camera disguised as a garden bird. The yellow monster appeared at the corner, its blade lowered like a steel jaw, followed by the White Hart's demolition pickup. And then, Alicia Thomas's immaculate white BMW glided gracefully to a stop at the curb. The door opened, and she emerged, an image of tailored corporate power. She was in a power red suit today, a slash of color against the morning green. Her hair was perfect. Her smile was brilliant. She looked like she was arriving at a ribbon cutting, not to oversee the destruction of a home. Her brother, Daniel Hart, got out of the pickup, a thick man with a bull neck and small, shrewd eyes. He had none of his sister's polish. He radiated an aura of brutish impatience. He began barking orders at his two-man crew, pointing at the guest house with a crude gesture. Moments later, 2 county sheriff's cruisers rolled up, their light bars flashing lazily. They parked behind the BMW, and 2 officers emerged. One was a young, nervous-looking patrolman. The other was an older, leathery man with a salt and pepper mustache and a world-weary air. Sergeant Miller, Alicia's man. I saw her greet him with a familiar nod, a small, conspiratorial smile she thought no one saw. "Thanks for coming, Sergeant," her crisp voice carried, captured perfectly by the FBI's equipment. "Hopefully there won't be any trouble, but with this one, you never know." That was my cue. Showtime. I threw open my front door and stormed out onto the porch, making sure my panic and rage looked authentic. "What the hell are you doing, Alicia?" I yelled, putting a deliberate crack in my voice. "Get off my property. You have no right to be here." Alicia turned to face me, and on her face was an expression of patronizing pity. It was a performance for the officers. "Calm down, Mr. Bailey," she said, her tone syrupy sweet. "We are simply here to enforce the community bylaws you agreed to. You've had multiple notices. You've been given every opportunity to comply." Daniel Hart snorted from beside his truck. "Listen to the lady, old man," he growled, "or we'll move you right along with that shed." I pointed at the bulldozer. "That machine is not touching my property," I yelled, playing my part to the hilt. "That house is legal. Your fines are a sham and you know it." This was the moment Patricia Williams had told me was critical. The public confrontation. Alicia now had a stage. She stepped forward, holding a sheaf of papers. "I have a valid execution order from the board. Mr. Bailey," she announced, waving the documents, which included the forged minutes, "and I have the presence of law enforcement to ensure it's carried out safely. Now, I'm asking you to return to your home, or I will be forced to have these officers remove you for trespassing." She had done it. She had publicly stated her intent, based on a fraudulent document, in front of witnesses and multiple recording devices. And now, for her final act, she turned to the man she believed was her pawn. "Sergeant Miller," she said in a commanding tone, "this man is obstructing an HOA enforcement action. Please remove him." The world seemed to hold its breath. Daniel Hart and his men stopped to watch. The young officer put a nervous hand on his sidearm. I tried to keep my own breathing steady. This was it, the final twist. Sergeant Miller did not move toward me. Instead, he executed a slow, deliberate pivot to face Alicia squarely. He looked her right in the eye, and the tired, bored look of a local cop was gone. In its place was a cold, razor-sharp focus. Alicia blinked, a flicker of confusion crossing her smug face. "Sergeant?" she prompted. "Alicia Thomas," Miller said, and his voice was completely different. It was no longer a folksy drawl. It was crisp, clear, and carried the authority of the federal government. "You are under arrest." Alicia's confusion turned to disbelief. She let out a short, sharp laugh. "Arrest me? What on earth are you talking about? Arrest him," she screeched, pointing at me. Miller didn't flinch. He reached into his pocket and pulled out not handcuffs, but a small leather wallet. He flipped it open to reveal a golden badge and an ID card. "Special Agent Miller, Federal Bureau of Investigation," he said, his voice ringing out in the sudden morning silence. "You're under arrest for mail fraud, wire fraud, and conspiracy to engage in a racketeering enterprise under the RICO Act." As if his words were a prearranged signal, the neighborhood erupted in coordinated action. A dark blue van marked County Landscape Services that had been parked down the street had its back doors fly open, and 6 men in vests marked FBI in big yellow letters poured out. The gray sedan I hadn't paid any attention to across the street came to life, and Mark Riley emerged from the driver's side, followed by 2 other agents. They moved with a practiced precision, a silent wave of dark suits and weapons. Daniel Hart and his men froze for a second, then Hart started to back toward his truck. "Freeze!" Mark yelled, and his voice had a command in it that froze all 3 men in place. 2 agents had them secured in seconds, but my focus was on Alicia. Her face was a canvas of total collapse. The confidence was gone, replaced by a hollow disbelief, then horrified recognition, and finally, a pure, white-hot rage. "You can't do this," she screamed at Miller, her voice becoming a shrill whine. "This is a mistake. I'm the victim here. We have you on tape ordering your brother to proceed with this action based on fraudulent fines, ma'am," Special Agent Miller said coolly, as he produced his handcuffs. "We have you on tape conspiring to seize this property. We've been tracking your brother's stolen construction materials laundering operation for 6 months. We have everything." As the metal cuffs clicked shut around her manicured wrists, the mask finally shattered. She turned and looked at me, and in her eyes was a raw, undiluted hatred so profound it was almost a physical force. "You," she hissed. "You did this." I said nothing. I just stood there as they led her away, her red power suit now looking garish and pathetic. Mark walked over to me, a slight smile on his face. "Not a bad performance, Colonel," he said. "I think she actually bought it." As it turned out, Agent Miller had been undercover in the county PD for 8 months, investigating internal corruption when he stumbled onto Alicia's connections with a few low-level officers. He was the one who first heard the whispers of her real estate scheme and connected it to the larger materials theft ring investigation. Alicia thought she was cultivating a dirty asset. In reality, she was confessing her crimes on a weekly basis to an undercover FBI agent. As the last of the FBI vehicles pulled away, taking Alicia, her brother, and the remnants of their petty empire with them, a strange silence fell over the street. Neighbors, drawn by the commotion, began to emerge from their houses, blinking in the sunlight, trying to process the drama that had just unfolded. They saw the silent bulldozer, the bewildered-looking local cops, and me, standing alone on my lawn. David and Eleanor Miller came across the street, their faces a mixture of questions. Carla followed, her children's hands held tightly in hers. I looked at them, and then at the guest house, standing there unharmed, a quiet symbol of a promise kept. The play was over, and justice, in the most dramatic and unexpected way possible, had been served. In the moments after the last FBI car disappeared around the corner, carrying Alicia and her petty criminal empire with it, a strange, almost sacred silence descended upon Maplewood Hills. The yellow bulldozer sat abandoned at the curb, a mute monument to a war just ended. The 2 remaining county deputies looked awkward, unsure of their role now that the main drama was over, shuffling their feet and aimlessly directing non-existent traffic. Then slowly, like flowers turning toward the sun after a long storm, doors began to open. Neighbors, who had watched the entire affair from behind window blinds and screen doors, began to emerge. Tentative at first, then with growing confidence, they gathered in small clusters on lawns and driveways, their whispered voices carrying on the morning air. They weren't looking at me with pity or curiosity anymore. They were looking at me with something else entirely: awe. David and Eleanor Miller were the first to cross the street, Eleanor holding fast to her husband's arm. "Austin," David said, his voice thick with emotion. "What? What just happened?" Carla Diaz followed, her 2 small children clutching her hands, her own eyes wide with disbelief. I took a deep breath, feeling the adrenaline begin to recede, leaving a profound but steady exhaustion in its wake. "That was justice, David," I said, loudly enough for the others gathering nearby to hear. Turns out, Alicia's whole scheme was much bigger than we thought. It wasn't just about bullying us. It was a criminal operation, and now it's over. The news spread from person to person like a shockwave. Whispers turned to excited conversation. Faces that had been etched with fear and anxiety were replaced with expressions of relief and righteous indignation. The stories started pouring out, no longer told in secret, but shared openly in the sunshine. Mr. Kowalski, the electrician, described how the fines had nearly driven his business into bankruptcy. A young woman recounted being forced to repaint her entire house because Alicia didn't like the undertones of the beige. Each story was a thread in the tapestry of abuse Alicia had woven, and now, in the light of day, the full, ugly pattern was visible to all. I was no longer a lone troublemaker. I was a vindicator. My resistance had validated their pain, and in that moment, a fundamental shift occurred. Maplewood Hills was no longer a collection of houses divided by fear. It was a community again. That newfound peace lasted for about an hour. Then the media arrived. The first news van was from a local affiliate, then another, and soon, our quiet street looked like the parking lot of a major sporting event. Reporters with microphones and cameramen with bulky equipment swarmed the sidewalks. They surrounded me, shouting questions. Who? What? When? Why? Patricia Williams had prepared me for this. She will try to paint herself as the victim, she had warned, and you as the villain. Our narrative has to get out first, and it has to be clean. So, when they shoved microphones in my face, I was ready. I didn't shout, I didn't celebrate. I told my story, calmly and methodically, not as a man seeking revenge, but as a concerned homeowner protecting his community. I spoke of my promise to my wife, of the guest house, of the fabricated fines, and of the other families who had suffered in silence. This isn't just a story about an overzealous HOA, I concluded, looking directly into one of the cameras. This is a cautionary tale about what can happen when unchecked power falls into the hands of those who disregard the very rules they are sworn to uphold. Every homeowner has a right to peace and security in their own home, free from harassment and intimidation. My statement set the tone for the entire story. By the evening news, I wasn't the unstable veteran. I was the hometown hero Army colonel who uncovered a criminal conspiracy. The footage of Alicia being led away in handcuffs, her red power suit now looking rumpled and pathetic, was played on a loop. The news laid out the charges in breathtaking detail. Federal prosecutors had called a press conference. Patricia Williams, poised and professional, stood at a podium and described the Thomas Hart criminal enterprise. She explained how Alicia used her position as HOA president to engage in systematic extortion, creating a pipeline of distressed properties for her brother's shell company. Then, she connected it to the statewide materials theft ring, transforming a suburban scam into a major federal RICO case. Two other board members, the ones who had meekly voted along with Alicia's every whim, had also been arrested and charged with conspiracy. They looked stunned and pitiful in their mugshots, small pawns caught in a game they never truly understood. In the days that followed, a cleansing took place in Maplewood Hills. An emergency community meeting was called at the clubhouse, and for the first time in years, the room was packed. The air was thick with anger, but also with a powerful sense of relief and resolve. The two remaining board members, who weren't charged but who had done nothing to stop Alicia, resigned in disgrace. The HOA bylaws were dragged out, and an interim board was established on the spot. David Miller, initially reluctant, was unanimously voted interim president. "I'm not a politician," he told his neighbors, his voice low and heartfelt. "I'm just a retired history teacher. But history has taught me one thing. The only thing necessary for the triumph of evil is for good men to do nothing. We have done nothing for too long. That ends now." Their first act, passed with a resounding unanimous vote, was to immediately nullify every fine, lien, and foreclosure action initiated by Alicia's board over the past 2 years. They also voted to repeal every bylaw amendment that had been passed under her leadership, including the fictitious Article 14, Section C. A cheer went up in the room. It was the sound of freedom, the sound of a community taking itself back. That evening, David, Eleanor, and Carla came over. We sat on my back porch, looking out at the unharmed guest house as the sun went down. Carla had brought a homemade pie. Eleanor had brought a small rose bush in a pot, a young peaces plant, to restart her garden. "We don't know how to thank you, Austin," Carla said, her voice catching. "You didn't just save your house, you saved all of us." I shook my head. "It wasn't just me. We did it together, an unlikely alliance." David smiled, a real, beaming smile for the first time in months. "History is written by such alliances, my friend," he said. "Ordinary people who decide they have had enough." We sat there in a comfortable silence as dusk fell, the fireflies beginning to blink on over the lawn. The war was over. The fallout remained. The big legal battles were still ahead. But for that evening, for the first time in a long time, Maplewood Hills felt peaceful. Not the false peace of forced compliance, but the real, deep peace that comes from justice served and a community reborn. A year can change everything. 12 months after that fateful morning, when the click of handcuffs was louder than the roar of a bulldozer, Maplewood Hills was a different place. The transformation wasn't just cosmetic, the replanted gardens, the re-erected playsets. It was a seismic shift in the soul of the community. The fear that had hung in the air like a toxic fog had dissipated, replaced by something we hadn't realized we'd lost: trust. The trial of Alicia Thomas and Daniel Hart was a media spectacle. It was televised nationally, a fascinating cautionary tale of suburban greed gone wrong. I sat on the witness stand for 3 days, under the harsh lights of the courtroom, telling my story. Guided by Patricia Williams, I laid out the events calmly, methodically, walking the jury through the journey from the first violation letter to the horrifying discovery of their conspiracy. My file, the black hardcover notebook, became Exhibit A. The forged meeting minutes, Mrs. Gable's shaky signature blown up on a massive screen for all to see, was Exhibit B. But the most damning evidence came from Alicia herself. The FBI's recordings were played in the courtroom, her own crisp, confident voice filling the silence, condemning herself with her own words. The jury heard her mock the old vet, order her brother to be done with this, and conspire with her board members to legitimize the fraudulent fines. It was a perfectly orchestrated self-immolation. Alicia never showed a flicker of remorse. Even when faced with irrefutable evidence, she maintained an air of offended arrogance, as if she were the victim of a great injustice. Her brother, Daniel, tried to blame everyone but himself, but the net had closed. The 2 complicit board members had agreed to testify against them in exchange for lighter sentences. Their testimony painted a picture of manipulation and fear, of how Alicia had used a combination of charm and intimidation to turn them into her puppets. The verdict came back after less than 4 hours of deliberation. Guilty, on all counts: mail fraud, wire fraud, conspiracy, and the all-important RICO charge. As the verdict was read, Alicia finally broke. Her perfect face crumpled into a mask of rage and disbelief. The sentences were severe. Thanks to the RICO statute, the prosecution was able to prove a pattern of organized criminal activity. Daniel Hart, the enforcer, was sentenced to 15 years in a federal prison. Alicia Thomas, the mastermind, the woman who had twisted a position of community trust into a weapon of greed, was sentenced to 20. Their little empire had crumbled to dust. While justice was being served in the courtroom, another kind of justice was taking root back in Maplewood Hills. Under the steady leadership of David Miller, the HOA was being rebuilt from the ground up. The meetings, once secretive, dreaded affairs, were now open, well-attended, and full of lively debate. The convoluted and punitive bylaws were scrapped, replaced by a simple, common-sense set of guidelines that were created with input from the entire community. The HOA fees were lowered, as it was discovered that Alicia had been padding the reserve fund for years. Instead of threatening letters, there were friendly newsletters. Instead of compliance walks, there were community events, a Memorial Day barbecue, a 4th of July bike parade, a community garden where neighbors worked side by side, their hands in the soil. Carla Diaz, once too afraid to speak up, now headed the welcoming committee, greeting new families with a gift basket and a copy of the new, simplified community rules. The neighborhood was healing. Eleanor Miller's rose garden was in bloom again, nurtured with saplings donated by neighbors. Carla's children's slide and sandbox were back in place, a brightly colored symbol of reclaimed childhood. The air wasn't heavy with suspicion anymore. It was light with laughter and the sound of conversations over fences. For me, the victory brought a new responsibility. My story had gone wide, and I began to receive emails and calls from all over the country. They were from military families, retirees, single mothers, all facing their own versions of Alicia Thomas. I realized that what had happened in Maplewood Hills wasn't an anomaly. It was a symptom of a much larger disease. I had been awarded a significant financial settlement from the civil suits against the HOA's now bankrupt insurance and from Alicia's seized assets. The money could have easily allowed me to live a comfortable life. But looking at the guest house, at Sarah's sanctuary, I knew I was meant to do more. My promise to her had been to help my fellow veterans. The fight with Alicia had shown me a new way to honor that promise on a scale I had never imagined. 6 months after the sentencing, I used the money to establish a nonprofit organization. I called it the Patriot Homes Project. Its mission was simple: to provide pro bono legal aid to active duty service members, veterans, and their families who were facing harassment and abuse from their Homeowners Association. I assembled a small, passionate team of lawyers, many of them veterans themselves, and we got to work. Our office was my home office, and our first case was a young sergeant in Florida who was being threatened with foreclosure because his American flag was allegedly too large. We won. The guest house, the place that had started it all, remained the heart of everything. It continued to serve as a temporary haven for veterans in transition, but now it was also a symbol. It represented the idea that a home should be a sanctuary, and that sometimes you have to fight to keep it that way. Tonight, I'm standing on my back porch, just as I have so many times before. A gentle breeze carries the scent of honeysuckle and cut grass. The lights are on in the guest house. Inside, a young family is sitting around the dining table. He's a Marine, just back from a tour, struggling to find work. She and their toddler are staying with us while he gets on his feet. I can hear the sound of their laughter drifting across the yard. I look up at the star-filled sky, and I think of Sarah. For so long, I thought my promise to her was just about providing a roof. But I was wrong. It was always about something bigger. It was about defending those who defended us. About making sure that when they came home to a country worthy of their sacrifice. A country where justice is more than a word, and a community is more than a collection of houses, but a promise that no one has to fight alone. The war with Alicia Thomas was over, but my mission was just beginning. And somehow, I knew Sarah would approve.